Hello and welcome to The Sexually Satisfied Woman. I am your host, Eva Blake, and in this interview series, I'm talking to a variety of experts who are uniquely qualified to discuss some of the most common challenges that we as women face in our sexuality. And over the course of this series, we're going to offer real practices and proven strategies to boost your confidence, ditch the shame, and create truly remarkable relationships and intimacy so that you can have the sexual satisfaction that you deserve, especially in these really uncertain times. And it is my pleasure to welcome Reverend Lacette Cross. She is the founder and CEO of Will You Be Whole, where she talks sex and faith for wholeness with Black women and LGBTQ folks. Her work equips others with the tools to define their sexual ethic, construct a sexual theology, and explore a sex-positive faith. She is an experienced facilitator, speaker, and presenter. Reverend L is the pastor of Restoration Fellowship RVA in Richmond, Virginia. She holds degrees in social work, divinity, and theology, and she grounds her work in womanist thought and from a place of love of God, love of self, and love of others, while in service to the collective liberation and safety of Black people and all of those who love them. And you can probably tell her favorite color is purple, and she loves reading good books. So welcome, Reverend L.
Thank you so much, Eva. It is a joy to be here with you today to talk about this amazing intersection that allows women to live our most whole and fabulous and pleasure-filled life.
Yes, yes. So how did you come to be doing sex-positive, LGBTQ affirming Christian faith work in the South?
Uh, that is such a great loaded question. And it has just been an unfolding of my life. I was a sex educator in my mid-20s. I was always that one person at church that young people knew that they could talk to about sex. I was also a youth minister. And so the evolution to where I am today was just like a culminating of events. I worked as a sexuality educator for about 8 years. I was also working in the church as a youth minister and then became an ordained clergy person doing HIV/AIDS ministry. And then I moved to Richmond to finish seminary and realized that Richmond, Virginia is the capital of the Confederacy. It is still considered the Deep South, and recognized that there was no space for Black women, or I wouldn't say no, but it was very limited space to talk about sex and faith. And so I created the space that I always yearned for myself. And so that's how Will You Be Whole got started on February 14th of 2015. And I held conversation circles with Black women, and then that just kind of evolved into presenting and speaking and facilitating. And all of my theological degrees have centered at the intersection of sex and faith. And so it just kind of has become this really beautiful calling that I have had, I think, just a unique and definitely humbling opportunity to be able to work with people at this intersection, which is a very sensitive space for a lot of people. Church, institutional church has both good and bad, and our sexuality has been seen from society and the church in mostly bad ways, but in some very small glimpses of good. And so that work has unfolded and has brought me here today. And I just remind and tell everybody that most oftentimes the work that we're called to do in the world is also the work we're doing for ourselves, right? And
For sure.
so, also I would be remiss to just think that I plopped up and just popped up and it was like, oh, I'm just going to do this because this sounds like a cool thing to do. No, like I came into my woman loving self at 30. I had my own crisis of faith. I had, little spaces where I could engage this conversation in honest ways, in faithful ways, that allowed me to question God, to question the teachings of the church, and lean into pleasure, lean into understanding my sexuality differently. So that is what
Beautiful.
brought me here today.
Yes, excellent. So in the past, you've said that we need a sexual ethic to understand scripture and ideas specifically around virginity or marriage or pleasure. So can you unpack for us what is a sexual ethic, and is that different than a sexual theology? Just what is that?
Yes. So I define a sexual ethic as a personally constructed statement that is informed by what you believe and your lived experiences that influence and guide your sexual decision making, your sense of your gender and sexual identity, and how you choose to express as a sexual person. The thing about a sexual ethic is that it is going to be responsive to your life as you change, right? So I'm 45, right? Who I am at 45 is totally different than who I was at 25. We say thank you for that. But also just this idea that our ethic is that which guides our life, right? It's some people confuse or conflate morals with ethics, and to not get us off into a deeper rabbit hole with that. But what I like to say is a sexual ethic is what is going to guide you. It's going to be the your North Star, so to speak, on who you want to be as both a sexual person and a spiritual person. What makes a sexual ethic uniquely different than a sexual theology is that for individuals who choose to stay connected to the Christian faith or to a faith that has a God or a deity, theology is the study of God, right? And so a
Mhm.
sexual theology is to lay out for yourself who you say God is and how God interacts with God's creation of sex and sexuality, right? And so our theology often informs our ethics. And my distinction many times is that for people who are what I name as you either grew up in church or you were church adjacent, right? So if you didn't grow up in church, you grew up in a community where you didn't go to church, but everybody used stories and lessons and like little idioms that come from church, right? So as a Black woman, the Black church is very influential in the community, and that means that God and the concept of God is passed down to us, right? And so therefore our sexual theology has to be the way that we understand God that fully embraces all of who we are as a sexual person, our orientation, our identity, our activity, that also says God is loving and accepting and creative and believes that we are divinely deserve pleasure, right? And so building that out for individuals is something hard because it often means that we are most times questioning the people that raised us, our mothers, our fathers, our
Mhm.
grandparents,
Mhm.
those people in the church that became like family, our pastors or
Mhm.
church leaders, priests, those individuals.
And I want to jump in here because, this, especially this particular teaching that, God is all loving and all seeing and all knowing, right? And will love you no matter what. But sometimes the teaching is, you're going to go to hell or bad things are going to happen to you, right? And so whether the teaching is formal, right, as in from the scripture or from the commandments, or it's informal, just like you shouldn't be doing that, right? A lot of that, in my experience, I grew up in the Methodist church, and a lot of that was around what you're supposed to do or not do with your body, who you're supposed to connect to, what your sexuality is, quote unquote, supposed to be, right? So how do we reconcile that disconnect, the disconnect between, well, God will always love you, but not if you do that with your body?
Yes. You are like down my street, Eva, because that is the work that I know that I'm called to do to help
Mm.
people wrestle with all of those layers, right? And one of the tools that I developed is called RAP. It is a theoethical reflection process. It's an acronym for wrestle, reconcile, accept, and practice. And the way that people make sense of all of those questions, right? Everything you just laid out, is to first wrestle with it. What are you exactly dealing with? To begin to then name some of the teachings that were passed down to you directly and some that you were socially inherited. All of us were socialized with in some kind of way. And then begin to say, these are the things that I'll keep, and these are the things that I will let go. And so there has to be a reconciling that happens, right? And once you reconcile, I no longer believe God to be a punishing, punitive God who's going to send me to hell because I love a woman. What do I get to replace that God with? Who now is that God for me, right? And is it even God? Is it spirit? Is it nature? Is it human ideals? Like maybe we don't believe in God anymore. And what does that now mean for a spiritual grounding, right? Because there are some people who have been so hurt by the church, by the institutional church, that they just don't even want to deal with God anymore. And I really just like to give people permission to name that. And then to accept it, to accept this kind of like new way of living, new way of being, kind of shame-free, bold, and saying, this is what I want and need for myself, and then practicing it, right? And practice makes precision, as some people say, but it is not about perfectionism, right? It's about process, right? It's about the idea that part of this work around sexual ethics and sexual theology, and living a sex positive, either Christianity or a sex positive spirituality, is to say, these are the things that I'm now doing, and allow them to work for you until you're ready to go to a different space. And then you learn some new, learn some other new tools.
Right. I love this. I love that you're giving permission for us to discard what didn't work, and that can allow us to then actually grieve. I mean, I grew up in the Methodist Church, and I'm just going to come out to my own audience here, which is to say that, I was very involved in my church as a youth. And, when we got a new pastor in the Methodist Church, every 4 years or so, we'd get a new pastor. So we got a new pastor, and then we got a new youth director, and they're both more conservative men than was our, previous church community. And as president of the youth council, right? I'm a leader of the youth council. And all of a sudden I was told that my leadership was not needed anymore, that I wasn't allowed to speak on behalf of or advocate for, or just say, hey, this is the way that we've been doing things in this really democratic process, right? For the youth to interact with the adults and the elders. And so that was a really big moment for me. A big moment where I left the church, and where other youth and parents and elders appealed to the bishop, right? The next highest level, right outside the church. And the bishop was kind of like, shrug, we're not going to do anything. Nothing's going to change. So I wonder how also, a sexual theology can help us reshape our community, our church community, to excise the patriarchy and to excise sexism. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, you're just gonna be like, what are your thoughts on how to reconstruct the church?
How do
right?
we do that?
Oh, this is simple.
Give me the answers.
I think no, it's okay, because you are asking the big questions. You're asking the right ones. You're asking the ones that don't have simple answers. That don't come with rule books. That don't come with guardrails, so to speak. It's kind of like every single one of us who have had, if not the same experience as you, some other defining moment that highlighted to us something related to patriarchy, sexism, white supremacist, capitalistic notions of like all of the things, right? And caused us to question, well, if this is how this is, do I still want to be a part of that, right? And I think that one of the roles of why I specifically use the word constructing a sexual theology is to say that you, as the person who is in relationship with the divine, get to define, what does this now mean, right? When I say that my sexual theology encompasses a God who created all of us in God's image with the same abilities and opportunities to live out our gifts, right? Or to practice new gifts. That means regardless of my gender, regardless of how I show up in the world, even if I am non-binary or if I am same gender loving, that this God has said, I uniquely created you to contribute something to the world,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that can also be a God that says, how do we then evaluate leadership that is
Mm-hmm.
diminishing our humanity, right? Right. This is the experience that you name, Eva, was not about you did something wrong, was not about something unethical that you engaged in. It was simply about one church leader's perspective and view on the roles of girls
Mm-hmm.
and women in leadership, right?
Mm-hmm.
To then construct the sexual theology that says all are able, right, and are born and created with gifts, abilities, unique talents that contribute to the flourishing of humanity. Lets you then have, or lets us individually have, a lens by which to actually, I would say, critique, evaluate our church spaces. The
Mm-hmm.
difficulty of that is naming that there is also some grieving that has to be done,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
grieving from the perspective of, oh, the thing that brought me joy, that did, for many of us, particularly I think female identified persons, I think marginalized persons in different communities, the church often is the space where we learn, where we do our first public speaking opportunity, right? Easter recitations. I
Right.
got
Right.
plenty of memories of those, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
and,
Me
so,
too.
and
Yeah.
yeah, right. So public speaking the church becomes a place for public speaking. The church often becomes a place where many of us do lean into our first opportunities of what leadership is. How do we work in teams? How do we work together? How do we figure out what our strengths and our growth edges are? To then have to say that that space is no longer safe for me to try
Mm-hmm.
things out is to also say, God, what did you do? God, why
Yeah.
did you bring these
Yeah.
people here? God, what are you saying about me? Right. And so to
Mm-hmm.
have a sexual theology that you work out, you construct for yourself, is to be able to, what I say, deconstruct some things and then reconstruct some other things.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I have to really verbally point out that it is not as simple as I'm naming the process to be. It is highly emotional, right? So you have to have
Yes.
a community of support. It is highly vulnerable. So I believe in Jesus and therapy. So get you a therapist, get you a wise person, right? Get you somebody where you can work out some of these things,
Yeah.
because this is such a deeply personal work, that to talk about it and then to go off and do our own work can just be hard. And we have to make
Right.
sure that we have a container or a community of people that we're connected to.
Right. And the church specifically as a space, can, for so many people, represents home, family, leadership, team, like you said, but it's such a big part of who am I? It's my identity, right? Because for so many people, this is how we grew up, right? So not only is it the first place that we learn leadership, but the first place where we learn, how can I love someone who's not in my family? Right. I mean,
Yes,
that was
yes.
definitely a learning for me. How do I love other people who are my age as friends and create really strong bonds and networks? So then when we think about or have the experience of, well, what's happening in the church or the leadership of the church doesn't reflect my theology, like you said, that is all loving and all people can, be leaders and are valuable and important. When that happens, if I leave this church, I leave all of these other people that I love
Yes,
because the
yes.
leadership isn't doesn't represent my theology, right? So how then, if we are, if we are queer folks, if we're marginalized folks, if the leadership just doesn't reflect us, how then can we look for leadership in other places? Like, so how can we look for a safe church? What might be some of the things that we can be looking for either in the sermon or in the structure of leadership that help us connect to what's more true for us?
Mm. Again, here you are with these simple, easy questions. I don't know. I think the question is the wrestle, right? Because for
Yes.
each of us, it's going to resonate deeply. So I would first like to say that our relationship with ourselves, which I believe is also our relationship with God. Like the
Mm-hmm.
deeper we go inside, the deeper we connect with God, right? And for
Mm-hmm.
those of us that are still wrestling with the concept of God, just the deeper we connect with the soul within ourselves, we cultivate a spiritual ear, so to speak, so that when you begin to say, I'm ready to go look for a community, I'm ready to go look for a church home or a excuse me a spiritual gathering space, um, your heart and your ear and your mind and your spirit are all working together. And the moment that you hear some, like you mentioned, sermon, if you hear somebody speaking and you get that twinge, trust it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it means that we have to cultivate something within ourselves to trust ourselves. I think the
Mm-hmm.
next thing that I personally found, and I can say in my journey when I was there, was who are my friends that I love and trust that either either I know me well enough, or I believe have or they have shared with me that they've gone through a similar journey. Where are they going? What are they watching?
Mm-hmm.
Who's on their, Facebook feed or well, I don't know if it anyway, Facebook feed, Instagram feed, Twitter feed that they're following, right? Or what church spaces or even other kind of, para church ministry type stuff that people are going to. So those are my kind of two, really, I think they feel simple, but they're not, but they are a way forward, right? Trust
Mm-hmm.
yourself, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
believe journaling is so important. I believe walking meditation is important. I believe silence and deep breathing are important in order to cultivate that voice within yourself where you begin to trust yourself, and then begin to ask friends to check out what other people are posting, or where who they're talking about, or asking those people, because most oftentimes, I know for me personally, I ended up in a church community because of a really good friend of mine, where she was
Mm-hmm.
just like, you've got to check this out, because she and I both came from the same fundamentalist church. And so she was just like, come check it out. I see you're wrestling. We've been talking about these things around sex and church and patriarchy and sexism. Just check it out, right? And
Yeah.
for me, that's how I was able to find a faith community where I blossomed and was able to grieve and to reconstruct my theology and my ethics and my sense of who I am as both a sexual person and as somebody that is a person of faith.
Beautiful. I think, when you're speaking, the thing that I'm hearing is that we find God in ourselves, and that we find God in other people. And that when we are not just open to it, but when we really are receptive of that, and when sometimes we even go looking for it, then that's when we can take the next step, right, in our path. I'd love to get a little bit more specific with you. What are some of the messages that are taught in the church that under-prepare women for sexual satisfaction?
That your body is not your own.
Mm,
I whether an individual is straight or they're queer in some kind of way, girls and women are socialized in the church to prepare themselves for somebody else, right? So it all starts with, Adam and Eve, right? So God makes Adam, and then he created Eve to be Adam's helpmeet, right? It immediately begins to send an unconscious message that who I am as a woman is to be there for someone else. So that's one of those messages about Adam and Eve. The other message that comes from scripture is, leave your family and cleave unto your wife, right? And so this teaching of when a man leaves his family, he goes, he finds a woman, he then marries her, and then she is now this prize for him, right? Where there's a scripture that talks about, he who finds a wife finds a good thing. I believe that's in Proverbs somewhere, right? So those messages that automatically say that women's humanity, right, our very being is to then be for someone else, is one of those teachings that come through. And that's if you're straight, or that's if you are lesbian or bisexual or pan, right? All of those. I think the other is that Proverbs 31, right? Which is really problematic. The Titus, there's a Titus text that talks about the older women are to teach the younger women. There is nowhere in the Bible where a older woman is teaching a younger woman how to appreciate her body. There's nowhere in the biblical text where a woman is celebrated for her sexuality, right? And I'm gonna take two examples specifically. If you read, or if your listeners read the Song of Solomon, which is an amazingly erotic text, right? Classic Christian church tries to make us think that this is about Jesus in the church or about God in the church, and it ain't. It is about a girl, right, pining, I don't know, that's an old black colloquial word, really longing for this man, right? But there are some points within the text where they're either called the daughters of Jerusalem or the daughters of something, where they are talking about her, right? The female protagonist in the text. And they are questioning her, saying, her talking so positively about her body, her being very expressive about her longings for this man. They critique her in a way, right, that is not positive. So even the one text that is probably one of the most sex positive, if you want to call it that, text within the biblical canon, still has a thread of, girl, you free, but don't get too free, right? You can't necessarily tell everybody that you want to, have sex with him, or you want him to, enjoy the voluptuousness of your body. The other text is the Ruth and Naomi story, right? Ruth um, um, where Ruth goes and she says, I'm staying with you, Naomi. Naomi's sons die. Ruth was one of, I think this is right. Ruth was one of the sons' wife. She says, I'm going to stay with you. These are two women within a culture where they cannot provide for themselves. Naomi has a little bit of family, people left. They go to Naomi's land. And then Naomi tells Ruth, you need to go and sleep at Boaz's feet, right? So this is also that text where everybody says, go get your Boaz, go find your Boaz. He's out there waiting for you. But what people don't realize about that text is that Naomi was pimping Ruth out for their survival. So when you talk about where are the texts that really affirm women in our pleasure, affirm women in the beauty of our bodies, celebrate, this amazing temple that we have, is very, very few passages that remind us of that. And so we have to learn to develop an eye towards reading the text with a liberatory lens, reading the text with an eye towards what can I pull from it that is affirming the fullness of my humanity, and that also says I am deserving of pleasure, I am deserving of care, I am deserving of being adored, and to be taken care of.
And yes, thank you so much. I think also the element of just contextualizing the text itself, right? How it came to be from, theoretically 2000 years ago, and how it showed up to be in print today, and how many hands or translations it went through that were all men up until the modern era, the last maybe even 50 years, right? So a very short period of time where women have been able to, do exactly what you're saying, which is interpret the text for our liberation, for our understanding, for ways that we find power for ourselves.
Yes.
I've worked with a number of women in my own practice who are ex-Baptists, ex-Mormons, ex-churchgoers, right? And a few who are still in the church and are really in a struggle, especially in the place of, I want to pleasure myself. I want to masturbate. And when I do, I get caught. I get stuck because the church told me that doing that was bad. So there's a real, physical, visceral experience that some women are having. And I'm wondering if you can talk to that. Like, what is a way that we can think about that specifically so that we don't clam up and shut down in our bodies?
Oh,
I
I
know,
was.
easy question again. I know, I'm sorry.
I think you are asking for what are the tools, right, that we can engage. And I just kind of wrote this down about 2 weeks ago, as I share on Thursday mornings with on my platforms as a pastor and as the Will You Be Whole work. And I named a process. I haven't named it yet, but I will say that the 3 steps that I offer to your question is to name the wrestles, name the guilt, name the barrier, the obstacle, name it, um, um, and then be able to name a practice that you're going to try, right? So what is the issue that so let's use the example of self-pleasuring. Okay, well, you want to self-pleasure, but what exactly are the feelings that come up when you either attempt it or when you do it and then it happens afterwards, right? Name those things. And then engage in the act, right? Engage in the act with this idea of like, I'm gonna go for it. I'm gonna just do it. And then when the act is over, right, reflect on how you're feeling, reflect on where are these feelings coming from. Are they what you really believe, or are they inherited opinions or traditions or teachings that you are having a response to, right? I think if we name, engage, and reflect on a consistent enough basis, that we can begin to really peel back these very thin layers, right? If you've ever cut an onion, they have that little thin layer of whatever that film thingy is, right? That, I think these processes of like being able to name something, being able to participate in it, right? You've got to call a thing a thing. You got to then still try it anyway and then reflect, right? Look back on what was really going on, helps us to do that really minute peeling back or shedding of some layers. Because as we talked about earlier, the role of a sexual ethic and in this kind of work is to say, what do I really believe that God has said about me and my body?
Right.
And that is where your sexual theology comes into play. Who is God? How is God really seeing this? How do I now see it for myself? And most oftentimes, based on the case study you provide, most oftentimes we come to the answer of like, I don't believe that. And now when you can say for yourself, I honestly don't believe that, then you can engage in it more often, and each time you engage in it, you have lesser degree of shame, guilt, or fear, right? Because part of this interesting dynamic that happens, Eva, in this process, I've learned over the years, is that you can explore something and you can analyze it and deconstruct it, but we have to do our own reconstruction. Reconstruction cannot come from someone else. Your work to now say, I want to get past these feelings of shame, guilt, and fear when I self-pleasure is also an act of declaration. It is an act
Mm-hmm.
of, if I use some good churchy language, it's an act of your will, right? It's an act of
Mm-hmm.
your declaring, my body is good. God created me with the ability to receive pleasure from this one body part. If you are a female body person, right? The clitoris only purpose for for being
Right, right.
around is pleasure, right? If the creator, if I believe that the creator has created me divinely and wonderfully and beautifully and created my clitoris to give me senses of pleasure, then I am going to celebrate that, right? By engaging in
Mm-hmm.
self-pleasure. And then we could do more iterations of that kind of process, as you talk about toys, whether people choose to introduce toys into their self-pleasuring process, right? Because sometimes toys and, particularly for women of a certain age, lube and the need for lube and those types of things also come with it its own type of shame, right?
Right.
And so that, I believe that that process helps us, but it's not a one-off process.
Mm-hmm.
It has
Right.
to, you have to keep, and I don't want to say you have to keep doing it every single day, but you do it to your growth level. And then when you grow to a
Mm-hmm.
point where you're like, oh, this is good, I'm doing this, it's good. And then something else will come, right?
Mm-hmm.
After you've enjoyed that kind of plateau,
Mm-hmm.
for a while.
One of the things I'm hearing you say is uh, that while we're doing this reconstruction, in some ways it is us parenting a little version of us that needs to grow up, right? Because as you said before, right, we've all socially inherited a bunch of stuff, which is all the messages that we got since we were a baby that were not in a conscious relationship with, because they were just poured into us, right? Poured
Mm-hmm.
in, lathered on, stuffed in, like whatever, right? And so we weren't able to differentiate ourselves then. And so now as an adult, we have to take all those baby steps to come to where we are now, to the age that we're at in our growth place. And I'm also hearing from you how important and valuable it is that we are connected in community somehow, small group, with our friends, with, finding other people on our feed, whatever that is, that we are intentionally creating community or surrounding ourselves with people who are going to affirm the messages that we want to believe. Right. So there's
Yes.
all this back and forth we have to do.
And I am a proponent of healing. Healing happens in community. The idea of being, whether you are in physical community or you are in virtual community, is to also normalize, right? So I just finished a cohort of Black women, walking them through the process of writing their own sexual ethic. The beauty about that process, Eva, was the connections that the women had with one another,
Mm-hmm.
both apart and with me, right? And so there is the space that you get to curate together with a group of people that then you take away when you go into your own quiet time, or you're on your walk or your run or you're doing your drive or whatever it is where you are alone by yourself, and you're recalling back lessons from, the cohort member that shared a story that really affirmed for you that you are not alone, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
all of us, and myself, you as well, all of us that are living and breathing in this moment and in this world, particularly in this time, right, in 2020, we all think that we are by ourselves. We all think that we're the only ones that have gone through this, right?
Right.
And one
Right.
of the reasons why I believe healing happens in community is because it is your modeling. It is something that you may share. It is something that that we connect on together, as
Mm-hmm.
just like
Mm-hmm.
that just amplifies the human experience, that we're all
Mm-hmm.
unlearning this thing that the church did to us, or that our
Mm-hmm.
parents or
Mm-hmm.
our caregivers didn't even know that they were doing to us, right?
Right.
Or that
Right.
we watched and we modeled through media and through the magazines or through the books that we read, or whatever we're consuming with our eyes and our ears, right? These lessons that are so insidious that they float right under the surface in ways that cause us to like think that they are they are not impactful. But when we start doing our own work, we begin to see how deeply entrenched,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
those things are. So you are right. I the more I do this work, both for myself and for others, I recognize that healing is a journey, and not, you know, healing is a journey, not a destination.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
in that journey, we are gonna we're gonna reach new levels, new plateaus. Sometimes we digress, you know, sometimes
Right,
we
right,
fall
right,
back. It's
right.
okay, right? And to have that feed, to be in a Facebook group, to do some small group coaching with thinkers like yourself or like myself, or and
Mm-hmm.
other folks that are out there, to have a therapist, you know, all of those things, like they all come together, and they work together for our good, for the good
Mm-hmm.
of who we say we want to be, and who I believe God, divine creator, like always wanted for us.
Right.
That this world that we live in, and the systems of oppression that are at play in the United States anyway, and potentially around the world, you know, are diminishing our ability to flourish.
Mm-hmm. Reverend L, we have to leave it here. I want to encourage everyone to follow up with you on Instagram and all your other platforms, because you are offering so much wisdom. And because there is so much unlearning that we have to do together, this may be part of our journey for our whole lives. And wow, what a gift it is to keep unlearning and then reconstructing for ourselves. To all the viewers here, please follow up and go through the wrap process so you can discern and recreate and get really clear and do a good piece of work for yourself. Reverend L, thank you so very much. It was a real joy to connect with you today. I'm sure that I could talk with you for another hour and a half, but we don't have that kind of time today. And to all of our viewers, please come back tomorrow for another expert conversation and exploration of sex, sexuality, and sexual satisfaction. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.